Howdy! For today's Jolly Lark, we're going to be going over some quick and easy techniques to make shimmering underwater bases. An airbrush is useful for these, but if you don't have one, you could do it with a thin dry brush. After that, I'm going to go over how you can make some cool underwater kind of ocean floor bases using some common stuff you might have around your house. To kick things off, we're giving a quick dry brush on top of some bases that have been primed white and then washed with Terradon Turquoise, one of GW's contrast paints. So you're going to take that base that's been painted turquoise and then dry brushed white and grab an onion bag. These are the sort of bags that, tangerines and onions traditionally come in. Look for the ones that aren't perfect grids, but are this kind of netty mesh like so. And then using the contrast paint mixed with a little bit of airbrush medium in your airbrush, just kind of give an irregular spray all over the whole base. It doesn't have to be perfectly even. You can make some areas a little darker, some areas a little lighter, but you don't want to soak it. This is a light spray that you're using to tint the dry brushed white texture that's on your base. Starting off with a very simple sand base here, just to show you the idea of how to create those shimmering kind of reflective lines on your base. And stay tuned, the rest of the video is about building up more complex ocean floor bases, and the same technique can be applied to those as well. So with that quick airbrush, this is super fast. You end up with a very cool little shimmering water effect. I'll show you on another base. Yeah, it's a little hit and miss because the patterns of the lines are a little bit unpredictable. You want to try to spray straight on and super fast. You just unwrap that. And I think that's a very cool effect for a water base, especially once you get a miniature on top. All right, so let's get into building some more complicated ocean floor bases. For this one, I'm starting out with a layer of super glue and then adding some little bits of crushed glass that I got at the local dollar store, a little half round bead that's left over from my bubbling mud bases that I did a video about a little while back. Also throwing on some little round beads and paint agitators, anything that has a kind of organic appearance. Spheres and circles work well to make coral. And you can just put a little thin layer of super glue on them and then dust them with some texture. I've got some little glass micro beads here that I got for a different project. Fine sand works well, and the white dusty stuff that I've used there is the Army Painter Snow texture, which has a very, very fine texture and works well for simulating a miniature coral or something like that. So here what I'm doing is I'm putting drops of water on a bed of super glue. This has a really interesting effect. When it dries, as the drop of water dries, you end up with a really neat little circular shape that kind of, to me, looks like a little bit of like an organic coral growth. All right, so for this next one, we've got some sponge, just kind of a kitchen sponge that I chopped up a bit, soaked it in some like school glue. Elmer's glue works. I happen to have some clear Elmer's there. As it's soaked in that glue, I'm dusting it with a little bit of the snow texture again to give it a little more dry brushable texture. Throw on a bead there that I got out of one of my daughter's crafting kits that has kind of a blobby organic shape, and just kind of gussing up the base a little bit with any sort of organic details. This is a fun process. These are underwater bases were really fun to make. Sprinkling a little bit of sand texture, kind of mixing up the textures. Another neat thing you can do with super glue is take advantage of the fact that it turns into plastic when exposed to water. This normally happens, just with the air, with the water vapor that's in the air, but you can speed this process along by dripping a little bit of water onto wet super glue. And then if you take a little wooden skewer or something, watch what's happening to the super glue. So this is just a layer of super glue with a little bit of water on top. You can kind of push the two together and force that chemical reaction that happens with super glue to speed up dramatically. And you can use that to get some really neat kind of rippling organic shapes that you could sculpt something like that out of green stuff putty or something like that. But using super glue with a little bit of water on top is a really fast and easy way to achieve kind of a randomized, rippling, organic look. Depending on what shapes you end up with, it's kind of random and unpredictable. It's not like using a proper sculpting putty. You could paint it up to make it look like coral. You could potentially paint it up to make it look like water. But it just kind of gives a little bit of a wilder, weirder look to the bases than you'd get with just a flat coat of a texture. So you just kind of a blob of super glue like so, and it happens almost immediately. You can see on the end of that bamboo skewer here, you're getting little strings of plastic that are forming as the super glue mixes with water. Don't use a brush for this. You will instantly ruin a brush, unless you've got some disposable brushes. I really prefer using just bamboo skewer where you can just cut the tip off of it once you ruin it and then resharpen it. Don't use brushes, and even metal sculpting tools can be hard to clean off afterwards. I like some sort of disposable tool, a bamboo skewer or a toothpick or something like that. So here we're going to really take advantage of that water superglue interaction for a cool effect. I'm going to coat the whole top of the base in a medium layer of superglue. You certainly don't want it dripping off the sides, but you want it, more than just a skim. You want a reasonable, kind of medium thickness layer of superglue on top. And with this layer of superglue, instead of applying texture to it, we're going to use those water drops to actually create the texture itself. With just a little dropper bottle of water, this is just 100% water. We're going to drip it on there. And as those drips dry, you're going to get those neat little circular, kind of hard circular rings that you can see in the inset picture. So the water hardens the superglue around the edges, and then as it evaporates, you get that really cool little texture. For the next base, we're going to grab some natural sponge. There's no right or wrong way to do this. These are really fun to make with whatever kind of natural or organically shaped materials you have around the house. So this is some natural sponge. I think this is like $1 at Walmart. I bought a little pack of these in the art supply sections. Giving that a good soak with white glue will harden it up and keep it sturdy and have it take paint well. Sprinkled it with a little snow texture will give some of that kind of nubbly texture that coral has. And then these big glass balls, or maybe these are plastic, that I grabbed from my daughter's craft shelf again. It's great to scrounge up there. You can browse the bead aisle at a local craft, arts and crafts store. Just coating that in super glue, dusting on some micro beads. I'll put a link to those down below. They're similar to the clear micro beads that some tutorials will have you using to make bubbles. So you can potentially use it for that effect too. So a little round orb with some texture on it, a little half round bead with some texture on it. And again, you're just kind of trying to build up a variety of shapes. When you look at a picture of a coral reef, there's a huge variety of life under there in different shapes and sizes. So what we're just trying to do is simulate that on each base. For my squads of Deepkin, my plan is to have a few kind of signature bases with it have these coral structures, and then mixed in with a few of the flat basic bases that I showed at the beginning of the video. So here's another thing you can do is coat the base in super glue, grab a little water mister like you'd use for your houseplants. Don't drop it on your fingertips as you're doing it. Although one advantage is that because the water cures it almost instantly, what I've actually got stuck to my fingers here is a bit of cured super glue that's not at all hard or painful to take off. So with this again, so essentially what we've got here is a layer of super glue with a layer of water on top, and just pretty quickly just kind of give it some little pokes and nudges, and very, very quickly you can have a sturdy plastic kind of irregular surface to the base that I think is harder to get with other mediums, and you're going to end up with something that's much sturdier because the super glue is turning into plastic as it reacts. You can always add a little more as you like, add a couple little beads or textures or whatnot to it. Again, much more beads from my daughter's jewelry making shelf here. And you can see in the upper left, after they're painted up, they've got a neat, cool little corally, aquatic creature sort of look to them on the base. You can also see in that picture the bases of some waving seaweed. And now that we finish this base, we'll show you how to make that seaweed using thin strips of styrene. So this is just some strip styrene, some very thin strip styrene I bought at my local hobby shop. I think it's Evergreen brand, but it doesn't matter. And all I'm doing is using a little votive, tiny little candle to heat up the styrene just enough that it gets soft and bendy. It's a little hard to see from this angle, but the styrene's probably 4 or 5 inches above the candle flame. And basically hold it with one end of the tweezers so that I don't burn my fingers, and just heating it up enough to have it get kind of floppy so that it kind of falls over, and then you can very quickly and easily bend it into the desired shape. Styrene doesn't have to get that hot before it gets soft. It is really, really important to not burn it. If it's starting to turn yellow or brown or black, it means you're burning the styrene, and burning styrene releases some pretty nasty chemicals. So maybe do this outside if you're not trying to film a YouTube video. But these are also very small strips of styrene, and I'm not holding it close enough that it's actually starting to burn. I'm just using the candle flame to get it kind of soft. If you want, you can also do it in longer strips like so, and then slice those strips up after you're done. Pick your poison. Whatever suits your fancy. You can kind of do it in longer strips and then chop it up as needed. You can do smaller strips that are ready to use. And then once you've bent them and gotten some nice organic wobbly shapes, just use a pair of scissors to trim them up. I think of seaweed and kelp as having kind of pointed ends, so you can pick which end you want to be sitting on the base, make that one flat, and then use a pair of scissors to trim up the end of the seaweed that's going to be pointed up into the air, up into the water. Hot glue guns work great for attaching the seaweed to the bases. The glue stays wet enough that you can stick the seaweed into that little blob of glue on the base, and the little blob of glue just kind of disappears into all the other blobbly textures on the base. Super glue can be a little bit hard to get it to adhere. The seaweed can kind of flop over if the super glue isn't fully dry, but I find the hot glue gun works great for attaching those and kind of stick it in, and then the hot glue is viscous enough that it stays where you put it. It gives you a moment of working time to kind of adjust it and make sure you like the angle of the waving seaweed. Put a little more in to secure it if you want. And you're not, that hot glue will paint up and prime up just fine. As we've been working on other stuff, the water droplets on the super glue have dried and left these little white rings of plastic on the base. So you can see in the painted version up top, it really is a neat kind of ripply, wavy, organic structure that's formed by the chemical reaction between the water and the super glue that I think would be difficult to sculpt and get a similar effect without spending a lot of time on it. This is just a really nice, fast, easy way to get an unpredictable organic effect. So using those little circles that are formed by the shape of the water droplet, I'm just dropping one of my little glass paint agitators in there, coating it with super glue, and that'll give me a little coral, some sort of little anemone ball that's growing in one of those little circular ridges, as you can see in the finished picture above. And with the bases built, it's time to get painting again. These have all gotten primed white and sprayed with a Terradon Turquoise, which is one of the Games Workshop's contrast paints. And then we're going to give them a quick, rough, heavy dry brush of white. This is basically the same idea as the simple bases at the beginning of the video, but we've just got a lot more detail, and you can really see that detail popping here. You want to use a pure white for this, not like an ivory or a bright ivory like I would often use for this sort of highlighting step. This is the Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White, which is a terrific bright white. And this is a heavy dry brush. I'm not painting it. It is a dry brush, but almost like a moist brush or a wet brush. I'm not wiping off a lot of the paint on the paper towel before going in there. And part of that is because these are very, very textured surfaces that can stand up to a little bit of paint. If you were doing this to a smooth surface, you might end up putting streaky paint on there, but the texture will grab the paint off the brush nicely. I had so much fun building all the little bases. I couldn't help myself, and I went ahead and built a big base too. Didn't film this one, but it's exactly the same techniques as I used on all the little bases. It's balls covered in super glue and texture. It's some wavy seaweed, some little plastic bits off of the Idoneth sprues for the fishes. It's some of the little beads from the crafting, some rocks and sand. Hit up your local dollar store's art section. You can find some nice little finds in there, little bits of cork and stone, crushed glass, pebbles, that sort of thing. Fun stuff to use on bases. So just all over dry brush of some bright white. And then once you're done with that, let the white thoroughly dry because we're going to be washing some color on top. So, just give it 5-10 minutes for the white paint to fully dry, and then it'll be time to add some color. So with your sprayed turquoise dry brushed white bases, Next up, what I'm going to do here is add just a little bit of some kind of pale, warm colors to contrast with the turquoise. I've got 3 different colors of contrast paints. I've got a yellow, an orange, and a red. Well, more of a pink. This is the Vulpes pink, but it's kind of a pale red, dark pink, kind of a magenta-y color. I also got a pot of the green out to use for the seaweed. I'm thinning these down with a little bit of the contrast medium, especially some of the bolder colors like the orange. My goal here is to get a pretty lightweight wash of color on the coral reefs, on the sponges, on the little spiky balls that I've created here, but to leave the ocean floor, so to speak, blue. So just putting a little bit of color on some of those structures before we take it back down to the airbrush zone and spray turquoise all over it again. The exact colors you're using here don't really matter. The technique is the same, to be putting kind of a very thin, almost watercolory layers of color on the structures you've built while preserving the turquoise shadows. These are the colors that I think are going to look good with my army that I'm working on. But, flavor to taste with the colors of your army, what you think is going to complement the miniatures that you're going to put on these. My Deepkin miniatures have kind of a cool colors with a little bit of orange, so I'm trying to use colors that are related in the pinks and the yellows category, not too much of the same color orange, because I think that might distract from the miniatures, and largely warm colors to contrast with the turquoise shadows. You can see on the palette here some of these colors are getting a little mixed and blended together, and that helps form some natural variation. And on the flat bases, you can add some little splotches of color too while you've got it out. These aren't going on anything, but they just add a little more depth to the final finished bases. There's lots of brands of transparent paints out there right now. I really like the Games Workshop contrast paints, but there's alternatives out there from Scale 75, from Army Painter, and those would probably work fine too. I'm using a green on the seaweed, just kind of giving it a wash all over of a nice bright green. The green can also look good if you kind of put a little bit of green around some of the other colored structures on the bases. Just have fun with it. These are a fun place to play and experiment with some hobby techniques and colors, especially an army that is using different palette of colors than you might normally with above ground miniatures. Thought this palette was a little limited and wanted a lighter yellow, so grabbed some of the Plague Bearer flesh. It's kind of a very pale yellow green. But again, the exact colors you're using here don't really matter, but you just want to be putting them on thin so they're looking pretty pale. And keep in mind that as you're doing this, these are going to look unfinished at this stage. This is not the finishing stage. This is getting them ready to go back for another layer of turquoise airbrushing. Now, just like the simple flat bases, we're going to wrap these more complex underwater bases in the same red plastic onion bag and give them a spray with, this is the GW Contrast Terradon Turquoise, through the airbrush. Don't go too heavy on this, just kind of a light spray to tint everything on the base. I'm mixing the Terradon Turquoise, which is a very strong color, with some contrast medium. And as you peel it off, you don't really have to let it dry. Get a similar effect that we got on the flat bases. It's not as obvious before the paint dries, because it does change color a little bit as it dries. And then we'll take it upstairs and give it one final layer of colors and highlights to accentuate the shimmering light effect. So this is the exact same base, haven't done anything to it. I just wanted to illustrate how different it looks once that sprayed on layer of turquoise is fully dry. And so then what I'm doing here is just going back in with another layer of white and simulating this sort of shimmering light that you see in underwater photography, and putting on this is a much smaller brush, just putting on a very light, hitting the tops of all of the surfaces, and then drawing in using the lines that were formed by the mesh as a guideline. Because the things that you built on the base lift the mesh up a little bit, like I said earlier, you sometimes need to accentuate those lines a little bit just with a light dry brush. Hitting the tops of the surfaces with another little bit of bright white helps to tell the story that the light is glinting off the top surfaces while preserving the kind of color to turquoise transitions that were created by the second spray. And then with exactly the same colors that you used before, matching the colors you used before spraying it to what's there now. So putting pink on what you painted pink before, putting yellow on what you painted yellow before, and so on. even thinner with even a little bit more medium, we're then going to just tint those highlights with the same color. That'll give you the effect of a bright highlight without all the highlights actually being white. You can look at that coral I'm doing there. That orange, it's very, very thin. I'm adding even a little bit more medium because I really just want a hint of orange on the highlights on that coral. I don't want it to be a bold, bright orange that it was in the earlier stage. I'm just trying to go over those areas and get a little bit of pure orange that isn't tinged by turquoise on just the tips and the tops of the different colored sections. These big flat bases are really fun to do if you were doing an Idoneth Deepkin army for Age of Sigmar or for Warcry that was entirely or mostly consisted of flying sharks and turtles. That would be a really fun opportunity to just do a lot of these big flat bases. You do have to keep in mind when building these that you eventually want to have a miniature on top of them, especially on the smaller bases. If you're working on an Idoneth army, just keep in mind to leave a little bit of empty space for the miniatures. Thralls with their hanging robes need a little bit more space than the Reavers, the Reaver archers. A lot of them are posed such that only 1 foot is on the ground, and it's pretty easy to fit them in onto a complicated base, as you'll see in the finished photos at the end. And if you use any of these techniques for your own miniatures, throw a hashtag Jolly Lark on there. I love seeing what people do with these videos. I'd love to see your results with these. I'm using this for the Idoneth Deepkin, but these bases would also look great for underwater D&D stuff or any number of different miniature ranges out there that you want to have a watery, oceanic feel to them. Zombie pirates would look great on these. I think an underwater Caradron Overlord's army would be a lot of fun, but possibilities are endless. You can put any army underwater. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Any questions, comments, let me know below. I'm always happy to help people out with their projects. And we'll see you next time for another Jolly Lark.